Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Ivick. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at ELB Learning, formerly known as eLearning Brothers. Today, we have a great session on instructional design versus learning experience design. But first, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording in your email. It'll also be on our YouTube and our blog later, so you can find it there for future reference. Closed captions are enabled, so if you want to turn those on for yourself, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window and turn those on. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to use the questions and answers panel. We'll get to as many as we can. If we can't get to yours during the webinar, we'll do our best to follow up offline. We also have live chat, so say hello, tell us where you're joining from, share your thoughts on what Brandie is talking about. Anything goes in the chat, as long as it's nice. And so joining me today, we have Brandie Jenkins, Learning Experience Design Team Manager from our Custom Learning Development team. And so without further ado, Brandie, I'm going to let you take it away and tell us all about ID versus LXD.
Hello, everyone. As Stephanie just mentioned, I am Brandie Jenkins. I am the LXD team manager here at ELB Learning, and I'm excited to be joining you today and to be talking a little bit more about ID and LXD. And I want to start off with a caveat that my team is both an ID, they are both IDs and LXD. We do not separate out those job titles for a reason, and you'll start to see that reason when I get to breaking down ID and LXD and what those mean. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this topic today is that there has been some recent debate on social media about ID not mattering and ID not being important, that we should focus on learning. And I think you'll see as I break down what ID is and how it contributes to LXD, that ID can and does matter in the overall creation of better learning experiences, which kind of connects back to our ELB learning mission of creating better learning experiences. So I want to start off with a question, and you guys can type your response in the chat. What do you think about ID or LXD in general? Is your preference more towards ID or is it towards LXD, or do you think that both are equally important? Go ahead and type your thoughts in the chat, and we'll see kind of where everybody stands. Just to give you an idea of some of the varying opinions that are out there about the two.
We're getting a ton of responses in the chat. It's actually, I feel like, pretty evenly mixed between people saying equally important, people saying LXD more important. Some people use them interchangeably. Some people, they say they're not sure and they're waiting for you to tell them.
Great. So, great. And so as I walk through this today, you'll see why both are important and why both really lead to the type of learning experience that drives that active learning, and helps the learner achieve the desired outcomes that we're striving for. So let's start off by kind of looking at a high level overview of ID and LXD, especially for those that are kind of new to the field or maybe even transitioning into ID or LXD. As you break down these two terms and what they mean, you'll see that there is a slightly different focus between ID and LXD in a lot of the definitions that you come across. You'll see that IDs tend to be more focused on the content. Typically what happens is someone will come to an ID saying, I need to teach we need to train on this topic or on this skill, and they will be given some starting content surrounding that request. They will work with their subject matter experts and their stakeholders to analyze that content and identify what is needed for the learner to be able to accomplish what was requested out of that learning request. ID tends to focus on the learner knowing the task, whatever is needed to achieve that goal, versus actually applying it through active learning. I tend to use with my team as I'm training them on various ID and LXD tasks, passive versus active learning, or push versus pull, are a few terms that I tend to use with them. And I tend to strive with our learning experiences, we tend to strive for more active learning wherever we can, wherever there are opportunities for them to be able to transfer that knowledge to the experience, outside of the experience, back to the workplace. That's kind of an ultimate goal when you combine the two, the ID and LXD. You want the learners to be able to remember what they've been taught. You want them to be able to transfer that back to wherever they're going after the courses, after they have been through the course, in a way that helps them achieve those desired outcomes. And usually most organizations will have had some desired outcomes as an ID. The ID will work with them to even fine tune and come up with. In some cases, an ID may have to show up as a consultant and help the organization determine what those outcomes need to be based on whatever gaps there are, performance gaps, and you'll see that kind of in ID processes as well. ID tends to be a little bit more systematic, and some people will say, okay, but ID is theory focused. That is true to an extent, and we'll talk about some examples of theories that drive learning later on, but it's not all theory. ID is systematically taking this content, taking whatever performance problem, whatever problem they're trying to solve, and working with it, organizing it in a way that helps the learner efficiently and effectively achieve those desired outcomes. And we'll break that down some more later as well. LXD, learner experience design, it's a little bit more focused on the learner's perspective. You'll hear terms like design thinking mentioned with LXD. A quality of that you don't see as much in ID as that empathy. Is it starting with being empathetic of what the learner needs, what the user needs, how they should how they can interact with the experience in a way that is memorable, in a way that will help them achieve their goals. And I'll break that down too. There's factors that are considered in user experience, like accessibility and things like that will matter to the overall design of the course as well. So let's talk about this debate that has been widely discussed on social media lately, and that's that ID does not matter in learning design. Based on that quick overview that you just saw and your past experience with the ID, what do you think about how it contributes to an overall learning design? Does it matter? Does it not? Go ahead and select yes or no in the poll, and we'll see kind of where we stand with that.
I'll give it about 1 more minute for you guys to click right there on the poll. But so far, I will say that there is a resounding majority saying instructional design does matter.
Great. That's good to hear, considering some of the recent discussions that have been out there. And I do advise that you always be cautious of those discussions that kind of can things as not mattering, because there's usually a story behind that. And I don't want to mention any specific names. I do see some of their points. We'll talk about some of these points later and what we can do about them. So that's great to see. I do see a couple of comments about not separating out the terms and things like that, and we'll get into that as we go along too. We'll show how ID contributes to LXD. The only reason why we started off separating out the terms here is because we want to give those that have not been exposed to these terms in a background of what they each mean. So if you break down the definition of ID even further, you'll find that there are a lot of different definitions. This is just a high level overview definition of what ID is. And I've wanted to really, on my team, we drive home the importance of ID being the creation of an experience, because ultimately that is what the learners are doing as they are going through a course. They will be experiencing that course, and whatever they take away from that experience is what they will transfer back to the real world. So I liked this definition as I was researching various definitions, because it does focus on making the learning more efficient, effective, and appealing. And in order to do that successfully as an ID, you have to first show up as a problem solver first. You have to try to understand what the issue is the organization that the requester is facing, what the issue is you're trying to solve with that instructional design, to be able to design it in a way that will solve that problem. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more here as well. So this is a thought to consider, and this is another point that I've seen widely made, is that good IDs know and practice learning experience design. And this is why we don't separate out the roles on our team. Our IDs are learning experience designers too. Because if you do not practice learning experience design while you're designing an overall course, you're going to run into issues with the learner getting frustrated because they can't navigate through the course, or they might get frustrated because they've got content overload. They've been thrown a bunch of information, but it's not really been designed with them in mind. Those are some of the kind of pitfalls you see as far as why ID has been criticized. We'll break down a few more of those later as well. So let's talk briefly about why ID matters in the creation of an overall learning experience. Instructional design in itself is meant to aid in creating better learning experiences. When it's implemented properly, you'll see some of these qualities in common. One of them is that it's very intentionally organized in a way that increases knowledge transfer. And you'll see some IDs may be familiar with terms like scaffolding, or even models like Gagney's 9 events or ARCs. Now, where I will say where IDs fall short sometime in this area is they may go back and rely on a model or a theory just because they know it's a way to scaffold, but they really haven't talked to their learners to see where they are at, or they haven't really assessed their learners' background and adjusted their design strategy in that way to account for where they are at. So you've got to be able to customize your strategies to the situation. good ID or ID matters. Also, it helps learners contribute to the achievement of their learning goals, and that's obvious. That's obvious with ID and both with LXD. You'll see some overlap in between these two definitions as we go through, and that's kind of another point to make as far as why we don't need to separate out the definitions and why we don't separate out the roles on our team. ID helps make sure that the experience is focused on engaging learners. And I'll break down here in a little bit about what engagement means, because there's also some criticism about engagement surrounding the fact that a lot of people think that engagement is all click to reveals, or it's drag and drops, or it's engaging. I think it's Kara North put it in one of her posts recently. Engagement is not about the fingers, it's about the mind. And we'll break down a little bit about what that means. Instructional design, again, can be framed as passive, which is sometimes too why it gets criticized. But good instructional design will also prompt learners to act, and it will prompt them to act usually in a safe environment to where they can practice applying whatever concepts they're being taught in a way that will help them to move up to that next level of mastery and take it back to their work and be able to perform whatever tasks are required of them. In some cases, they may not be always asked to complete a task. It may be a compliance requirement that they're required to know. But a good instructional design even surrounding that, it will show them the importance of the requirement and why they need to take it into account in their jobs or in whatever situation is the context is presented in. So let's talk briefly for a minute about engagement. The three dimensions of engagement, and these are just a couple of examples of engagement that is in the mind, not in the fingers. One key component of engagement that I often call out as I'm reviewing storyboards, as I'm looking at portfolios or samples sent to me, is cognitive interaction. And cognitive interaction happens in the mind. It means that the learner takes that information. They're committed to taking that active approach to learning and committed to achieving those requirements, whatever it is that we set forth throughout the experience for them to be able to achieve, to be able to reach those outcomes. I'll break down here shortly some learning theories that help learners achieve some ways that we can cognitively help learners to move to that next level, and we'll talk about that. Behavioral dimension of engagement, and this is where they are not only retaining that information, it is meaningful to them, and they are taking that knowledge outside of the experience. And ultimately, I would hope that this would be a goal of both IDs and LXDs, that they would want to talk about that experience outside of the shell of a course, even if it's an e-learning course, that they are able to use it to improve their behaviors or improve or have an altered perception in some way, if it's not necessarily a goal to improve a behavior. A third dimension of engagement that I often see missing too from some of, especially from e-learning courses, is that connection to others, that emotional connection to the experience and to others. A lot of times what I'll see in storyboard reviews and things like that, and even sometimes in IL instructor-led material reviews, is IDs will use strategies like storytelling very passively. They'll introduce a story, but they won't follow through with the story till the end. And so you've got the story for the sake of having a character, but not a story for the sake of emotionally connecting to the learner, as well as for elaborating on the importance of the what you're trying to teach. So you kind of left the learner kind of hanging on a cliff there as far as what they're doing with that story. It can be kind of frustrating to a learner to be exposed to that, and they don't really know what they're supposed to do with it. So these examples of theories that actually do drive learning, because I wanted to talk quickly about this as well, because that's another piece of criticism about ID. ID is all theory, and we need to know all these theories, and it can be overwhelming to someone new that's entering into the field. Yes, that's true. Yes, trying to learn ID, all these theories can be overload. These theories come in handy, though, for an ID that is planning out a learning experience design. And ideally, what I see the best ID doing is that they may not apply every theory to a T. They will take bits and pieces of these theories and apply what works best, what they think will work best for that situation and for that learner. These are a few examples of theories that I find very helpful in working on a design strategy. Again, what I use depends on the situation and the context and the goals that we're trying to achieve. As an ID, we have to know those things first before we select even what strategies or what models or what theories we might use. So one of the theories that's kind of a little bit more of a modern day theory that's especially useful for planning is novice text for theories. And you may have heard me talk about this in previous webinars. This kind of shows that this example connects back to a theory that drives learning and back to that debate about but ID doesn't drive learning. This type of theory, this Benner's theory that was originally founded by Patricia Benner for nurses, is an example of a theory that intentionally does drive learning. It helps when applied. Its intention is for the learner to be able to master what they need to be able to move up to the next level. And it takes into account ways that a novice expert might learn differently than an expert. If you get a novice, if you're trying to teach a novice certain skill sets, it takes into account that a novice learner is going to require things like a little bit more instruction than an expert who might become annoyed at getting a lot of background information when they can just go in and they can make their decisions without needing that information. And so knowing these is really helpful when you're planning. And they do require that you kind of assess where your learners are at first, and that you know some of their background. You'll have to ask your they do require asking those upfront questions and doing that upfront analysis to see where they're at. So this is kind of an example of a breakdown of the differences in how a novice learner might think versus an expert. An expert is a little bit more intuitive. They can recognize problems and examples a little bit better. And so when you're thinking about how you're going to design a learning experience, those are good things to take into account with how you organize the information and how you present it and what you even include in that experience. I do see a lot of comments in the chat. Stephanie, do we want to pause for a second and answer some of those questions?
Sure. I think we've got quite a lively debate going in the chat. Let's see. Chris says, knowing the theories is like having a full set of power tools in your toolbox. Ahmed noted that this, what you're showing right now, is similar to the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition.
Yes.
And yeah, there's a lot happening in the chat. Some people are noting that, a lot of these ID, LXD, the job titles are all kind of based on just what your company wants to call it. And it can mean a lot of different things. And sometimes you're limited by what your company is willing to do or your resources. There's a lot.
Yes, I think even in situations where the company wants to call it an ID, I think, if you are even an individual ID, you can still take that perspective that, okay, I'm going to think about the user experience. I'm going to think about the learning experience too, as I'm designing it. In schools now too, you'll find that they are a lot of times teaching IDs to think from that they are LXDs. At Capella, that's the term that they use for ID as learning experience design. Because they wanted us to think from that broader perspective of learning experience design too. And I'll break down that here in just a second. I did see a couple comments about, I wish we could have this all in one training. And some of these that I've said we'll talk about later, I am going to cover in this. And there may be some pieces that we'll want to dig into later, and we'll see what those are once questions come in. And if we need to have any follow-ups, then we can do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, this is kind of just an example of how you might organize a learning experience differently based on your knowledge of where the learner stands as a novice to expert. I do have a full presentation on this that I can share with anybody that would like it. And if you would, just let us know. We did have a previous webinar where we covered this. And I do have some documents and research that I've done on this as well. Again, this shows how the approach is different for an expert versus a novice. An expert obviously is going to be more open to very, very decision making, very rapid approaches to decision making. This is where some of your very quick activity simulations, even some cases, deep branching scenarios come into handy, where it's really focused on decision making and working through that complex problem. So let's look now at a little bit closer at LXD and how it connects to ID. one of my friends, Marty Rosenheck, did a really good webinar previously breaking down LXD in very good depth. So I do want to give him credit for that here. It is out on our blog if you want to see more about what he had to say. It is a good one as it goes into a little bit more depth than I'll go into about design thinking and some of the deeper components of LXD. LXD is similar to IDEA. It's very learner-centered, and it's the process of facilitating the learning and application of knowledge and skills by providing a set of learning activities supported by content, feedback, and technology. I think one of the keys here is that LXD also takes into account the technology and how the users will be interacting with the technology, where sometimes someone coming new into the field of ID may not always think about how the overall user experience with the technology. And I think one of the criticisms you'll see out there is click next to continue. That's something that you'll see in some courses where the user has said that, and maybe your learner doesn't need to see that click next to continue every time. They might even become irritated at that. And that's something I'll call out too in my course reviews when I see them, like, I think, do they really need to see that? A key component of LXD is design thinking. Design thinking, as I mentioned earlier, includes an element of empathy that we don't see a lot in ID. It requires you to consider who the end users are, not just who they are, but what matters to them. And that perspective is helpful in connecting with that emotional side of LXD, or that emotional aspect of the experience. It also does, similar to ID, and you have to go into the design of the experience, understanding what the problem is that needs to be solved, and what the user needs or learner needs to be successful in solving that problem. And there are a lot of things that will come into play with that, including your situation and the context, the environment, even in LXD is also important. You know, if they're using technology, will they have access to the technology? We've had some clients come to us and say, okay, we need an e-learning course on this, but we only have a very tiny segment of users in this country that won't have access to this. So we need to figure out a way to include them in this training as well. And so that's where, you know, when you're in that design phase, you have to do that analysis up front, again, to figure out what your learners need to achieve those outcomes, even what might hinder them from achieving those outcomes. And you'll see an ID will do that during the analysis phase as well. At least a good ID will try to identify what those gaps are and what they need to address in that experience to be able to close those gaps. So you'll see an ID. I didn't cover the ID model because the ID model is not, the ID model is just a high-level ID framework that you'll see some IDs refer to, and it's kind of similar to this. I didn't cover it because a lot of organizations are taking more agile approaches than ID with ID. And so you'll see stages like prototype relates to the development phase of ID. You'll see testing. Testing also relates to the development and the feedback stage of that. One thing with testing too that LXDs will also consider too is how can an experience be proved based on the feedback that you've gotten from the learner. That usually for me includes also global client reviews if it's a global audience, because you want that perspective too of whether or not that experience is culturally appropriate for them, culturally relevant to them. And even some cases down to whether or not the language is appropriate. So it's always good from an LXD perspective to include those end users in those reviews and get their feedback so that it is the most relevant and the most meaningful to them. How can it be improved? Again, you may not always have perfection in every deliverable, but getting that feedback is a good way to plan even your next learning experience. So an LXD will think ahead in that aspect. And you'll see that too. Sometimes IDs will do that via Kirkpatrick's and other evaluation techniques as well. But your LXD will also think about the UX in some cases, how the users are clicking through, and I hate to say clicking because we don't, engagement doesn't happen in the fingers, it happens in the mind, but how they are navigating through a course, or, how they are, well, the accessibility features is another one. Are they able to view things like closed captions and things that they need to be able to complete the experience? Design aesthetics is another big one that I tend to give a lot of feedback on. We'll see a lot of times IDs will just put images in for the sake of just putting images in. And it's not really relevant to the context of what's being discussed, or it may not even add value to the overall experience. It might even in some cases be distracting from the experience. You'll see a connection with this to multimedia theories. Multimedia theories will go into a lot of detail about the use of imagery versus media versus audio and narration to facilitate, to handle things like cognitive overload, and to create a learning experience that is really memorable for the learners and that minimizes those overload factors. Myers multimedia theory is a really good one if you are designing learning courses or e-learning courses, videos, or even blended learning theory, blended learning experiences. Performance is another kind of overlap between ID, because a good ID should always have those performance goals in mind. Sometimes when you see an ID create an interaction, an issue, a common issue is that it doesn't necessarily always connect back to what that desired performance outcome was. They might say, okay, can you categorize this or sort this term, sort these process steps, when really sorting the process steps and being able to know which order they're completed in isn't really the important thing, because technically a lot of processes can be completed in multiple different orders depending on the situation. it's really knowing the more important factor might be knowing how to complete the steps in different situations as opposed to knowing how to sort them. So those are some things that both IDs and LXDs would need to complete or need to take into account when they're designing those learning experiences. I see a few more comments and let's pause for a second. Stephanie, do you want to check on some of those?
Yes, we had some great feedback on that previous slide. Let's see, Andrea said, in addition to, this one, who are they, what matters to them, you could add in what are their limitations, yes. Specifically like to keep in mind accessibility and section 508. It's a little bit more specific than just what does the user need to be successful, which could be talking about their job roles and the learning objectives, but we definitely want to keep in mind accessibility. So I think that's a great point. And then let's see, Maribel said adding in the why, because sometimes like what is behind the scenes, like why this learning is happening can be a really important point to keep in mind. And then let's see, another point saying the emphasis is on the designer's experience, professional character, and how they view or approach their ID work, not necessarily the title of the work.
Yes.
Great points, everyone.
Yes, yes. And I think we kind of touch a little bit on the why here as well. And I think you'll find that an ID, a good ID will go into that as well. They will go into that analysis phase asking, why this experience is important. Why are you trying to achieve what you want to achieve? And that will help them figure out what direction they need to take it in. So we've talked a lot about some high-level things I've briefly kind of mentioned throughout about, where IDs have fallen short. I wanted to get your perspective on it as well. Where have you guys seen IDs fail in terms of designing an e-learning course or even an instructor-led course? What are some of the common pitfalls that you've seen when focusing on instructional design?
All right, I know this is going to be a good one in the chat.
Yes.
So I think everybody's typing right now, but the first answer in is building for the stakeholders instead of the learner, forgetting the diversity of your audience, straying away from the main learning objectives. They're coming in fast and furious now.
I knew.
Clear learning objectives, getting so caught up in the investigative phase that the project falls behind and the need for the education is no longer relevant. Focusing on the technology and not the objectives. There's so many suggestions in here. Let's see, ID fails when the designer fails to do good work and employ design methods, not designing the judgments appropriately, lack of evaluation after the content goes live, not knowing the target audience, not having a project plan. I'm just going to take all of these answers and put them into a blog post called Instructional Design Fails. So thanks everyone for doing my job for me. Appreciate it.
Yes. So I think, yes, these are all great. These are all things that we've touched on. And I think these are all things that are contributing to some of the criticism that ID has been getting versus LXD or versus what I've seen a lot of folks lately say we should focus on learning. That to me and my personal opinion is that that's kind of a vague definition, and that's the ID in me saying, okay, well, how do we focus on learning? And I think when you look at it from the broader perspective of ID being a component of LXD and how the two all fit together into one, and then you'll see, okay, this is how we drive that learning.
I'm going to share one last comment because I think it was really great, and then I'll go away. Skipping the needs assessment altogether to adhere to what the client says their training needs are.
Yes, I think that connects back to being an order taker first, a problem solver second or third, or maybe even not at all. And I think that happens a lot with I see that happen a lot with folks that are doing rush jobs, or they just want to get in there and they've won this bid on this project and they want to get it done so they can get paid, and they don't stop to think about, okay, what is really needed to be successful for what is really needed for the learners to be successful. So that ties back to my first point, which is what you just said, is they don't try to understand what the issue is and what the objectives are first before jumping into that instructional design. The other common issue that we've talked about is information overload. You'll see an inexperienced ID or an ID that's new to coming into the field. They will chunk all the content into big, long courses that the learners ultimately will forget. And that's where that click next to continue comment comes in too, because you'll see some courses that focus a lot on the no, but you're not really sorting out the need to know versus the nice to have. And that's one of the tasks that an ID will do, or that an ID should be doing when they get a request to design a course. They should be working with the SMEs to sort out, okay, what do the learners need to know to be able to achieve these goals versus what would be nice to have as performance support material or job aid, especially in an e-learning course. When you throw a bunch of content on a screen without considering just what the learners need to know, you are going to overwhelm them and they will experience cognitive overload. And I like to when I'm doing my reviews, I'll fall back on multimedia theories again with calling out when there's too much text on a screen. And I'll ask the IDs to really consider, okay, how can you trim this down in a way that only focuses on what's relevant to what we're trying to talk about here? How can we make, XYZ a job aid, or how can we trim this in a way that's digestible to the learners in an online setting? And a good strategy that I like to use is the 5 + or - 2 rule for as far as what learners can remember at a time. And that ties back to multimedia theories as well. Ambiguous navigation and unclear instruction is another issue that connects back to user experience. That is where the learners are, where you may see IDs introduce an activity, but they don't fully tell a learner how to complete that activity, or they might include things like click next to continue, or include double navigation. In some cases, I've even seen that as well, where they might have a forward arrow in the navigation menu and a button to click on the screen. And then you've got users who haven't been exposed to that type of experience that are clicking all over the place, saying that they missed the content because they had too many buttons to click. another thing that an ID does is they do try to go in and make sure that the information is logically organized in a way that promotes learning, and that should be their job. And I like to, one of the peeves I have when I review storyboards is copying and pasting the client's content into a course. To me, that's not instructional design, and that's not taking that intentional effort to logically to organize it in a way that scaffolds the experience for the learner based on where the learner is at. And that's where you have to do that analysis and that upfront audience assessment to know where they're at, to be able to design it accordingly as well. Irrelevant imagery is another peeve, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that. Irrelevant imagery. I think the one thing I did not mention that was mentioned in the comments was diversity. Diversity is very important. A couple things with diversity too. It's not just, your race or your gender. It is really making sure that the imagery is relevant to who your audience is too. Sometimes what I'll see is an ID will come in and they'll put imagery of someone with a suit and tie that's working on a manufacturing floor. And I'm like, and I have to call that out, because a manufacturing floor worker is most likely not going to be wearing a suit and tie. And that could become a turnoff to a learner going through that course if they do not see themselves in that course. 6, by do not following through for that point, that ties back to the learners a lot of times introducing a story or a comment or context for a task without really following through to provide closure to the learner. And that goes back to that intentional instructional design and making sure that you are tying everything together for the learner at the end, and not just leaving them hanging and saying, okay, what do I do next? What am I supposed to do with what you just gave me? And there's a lot more reasons that we covered and that you saw in the chat as well. These were just so a few things that I commonly see when I'm reviewing a course that can be a real turnoff for the learners, and it can cause some criticism of IDs in general. Stephanie, I see a few more comments coming in. Do we have time to address any of those?
Sure, I think we could take a look at a few of these. Let's see. So Salvatore says, speaking to being a problem solver, IDs often go wrong when they create a training solution for the sake of doing so, when maybe the problem doesn't actually require training. Sometimes you have to help the customer see that training is not always the answer.
Yes, I think that's a big one as well, and that it's part of, doing that analysis and not being that order taker as well. And it may be that you have to kind of be that consultant with whoever your stakeholder is and say, look, there's a better way to do this. Let's take a closer look at this and see what that is.
Yes, and then let's see. Many higher ed institutions fail to see how IDs LXD is not a threat to academic freedom of their faculty. And then also a note about diversity exclusion often includes socioeconomic as well as cultural. So it's just some things to keep in mind to make sure you're kind of hitting all of that.
Yes. And we could do a whole another webinar on that. I think we have a couple that we have in the past, but yeah, that is a topic that is increasingly important to be able to make sure that we are acknowledging and that we are inclusive. Um, all right. So that is all I have on this one. I will pass along this presentation to Stephanie for anyone that would like it. Stephanie, will you be sending this out in the email after?
Yes. So
Okay.
I will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered. That'll include the recording of this, Brandie's slides, and also a link to the recording of her past presentation on novice to expert instructional design strategies. She mentioned that earlier, so I'll share that as well. And then all of this will also be on our YouTube in a day or two and on the blog in the future. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. If you want Brandie's Genius Brain to help you with your learning, she is a member of our custom e-learning development team, and we would be happy to help your company out and create the interactive, effective learning of your dreams. You can reach out to Brandie. There's her email. You can also reach out to us via our contact form on our website and schedule a free consultation with our custom team. Otherwise, hopefully we will see you at a future webinar, and we really appreciate you all spending your time with us today. Thank you.